recommendations of that, along with some disasters in that intervening period. Impacted by those that everyone's working towards the full recovery. Making sure that the disaster adaptation plans are robust and work for local communities is actually fundamental to how we're going to deal with disaster risk in New South Wales into the future. As we said when we released the State Disaster Mitigation Plan, prior to that and since, the government is keen to shift the dial when it comes to where the focus of our spend is with respect to disasters. You previously recall I mentioned that 97%, historically 97% of expenditure has come after the disaster effect, only 3% before, and doing some more work on the before will hope to reduce the extent and length of the disaster impact in afterwards. And making sure those local disaster adaptation plans are in place and are working well is central to that. So these plans will guide better land use planning, investment in risk reducing infrastructure, community education and awareness campaigns and the like. They'll also support, and they're very important in supporting future funding and financing decisions that are going to be made by not only the state government, but also by the Australian government. It's also increasingly important, we hear, through insurers as part of the global risk assessment and global reinsurance market, that recognising the risks and trying to do things to adapt and mitigate them in the future is going to be all the more important. So we wanted to provide this briefing to you today in recognition of the important role that local government is going to play in this. It's important that we work with councils and you work with us to develop those good place-based plans because there's elements that we'd never be able to pick up that you know all too well about your local communities and the way that disaster can impact on them. So working collaboratively across all those levels of government is going to be important to making sure that we get the best possible outcomes out of these plans and the greatest possible risk reduction out of the implementation of them. So that's why we're pleased that you've come to the table on this. The Reconstruction Authority has drafted some guidelines to support the development of the disaster adaptation plans, and they are part of that collaborative approach that the state's taking to disaster adaptation planning. So it's important over the coming 8 weeks, I believe it is, that we get your feedback on the guidelines, on what's in it, and that'll be supported by the workshops that we're doing. So please get involved. Make sure that you're having your say, make sure you're shaping and helping to shape the disaster adaptation plans and the process to formulate them and update them into the future so that we can get it as right as possible from the get-go, but also so we have a means and a good way of updating them periodically as we're going to need to into the future. I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of good and collaborative discussion about how we do these things and making sure that not only those local idiosyncrasies are taken into account, but also the broader role of local government is brought into these areas. Also, how we might do them across multiple local government areas where there's a more regional approach. So today is about moving that process forward, reviewing and getting comment and feedback on the draft guidelines that the Reconstruction Authority has prepared. So I hope you'll find this to be a useful opportunity and a good opportunity for that consultation, for that discussion, and for achieving those better outcomes. So look, thank you everyone again for being part and parcel of this process. I'm going to hand back to Mal to carry on the presentation, and I hope that and trust that you'll all come to this process in the same with the same willingness and desire to get better outcomes for communities as the Reconstruction Authority and the New South Wales Government have in putting it together. So thanks, Mal, and back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Minister. Thanks for your support and your leadership on the matter. I just thought I'd give a quick overview of the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. It probably then sets the context for why it was so important that we collaborate with you on these guidelines. The RA Act commenced in December 2022, and it was actually a pioneering piece of legislation. What it did was change the dial, as the Minister mentioned. So from going from an agency that had previously been focused on recovery, it really now puts an emphasis on that front end, making sure that adaptation and mitigation and preparedness is where we start. The work complements the emergency services. Have always done a great job in emergency response, but obviously the better that we plan, the better that we mitigate, the better that we reduce risk, the better that communities actually go through emergencies, but also recover from them. So when the RA was established, it was given greater powers to make sure that we really did focus on adaptation and mitigation. One of the requirements of the Act was that we had a state disaster mitigation plan. And as you are aware, that was launched in February this year. It's a significant piece of work. One of the requirements of the SDMP is that we have disaster adaptation plans. So today is really about making sure that we commence the engagement, making sure that the draft guidelines meet the needs, but really recognising the role of local councils, local communities, because you have a better understanding of the space in which you live. The State Disaster Mitigation Plans sets the state's approach for risk reduction. It provides a range of solutions to be considered in disaster risk reduction. One of the key goals of the SDMP is to support the development of place-based disaster adaptation plans. It does this by identifying actions to fill the necessary policy and program gaps at a state level, to support the identification of risk reduction options and actions that are required at a particular place. What is important is that disaster adaptation plans have legislative weight. Planning authorities are required to consider the SDMP and DAPs in district or regional strategic plans per Part 3 of the EP&A Act. And in exercising the EP&A Act functions, development assessments under Section 38 of the RA Act. It's one of the key reasons it's important that this is a collaborative approach. We want to make sure that we are working with local government to make sure that the guidelines accurately represent what we're trying to achieve, which is to reduce the risk to our community so they can live safer. With that, I'll hand over to Amanda Leck, who is the Deputy Secretary here, who will take you through more detail on the Disaster Adaptation Plan guidelines. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks very much, Mal, and also thank you to the Minister. So what is a DAP? I'll go through that in a moment, but just to note that we are going to respond to your questions that are in the chat, so please keep the comments coming online. We'll either respond at the end or we might even develop some FAQs for frequently answered questions. So I encourage you to keep those questions coming as we work through this presentation. I'm going to start off by giving you an overview of what a DAP is. So DAPs will bring together information on risk from a range of natural hazards, including floods, bushfires, coastal hazards, heat waves, storms, and landslides. In recognising that there is no single or simple solution, a DAP will consider a range of options to reduce the risk. These options can be taken to reduce risk both now and in the future. They might be proactively implemented, such as building a levee in anticipation of a flood event, or activated when a certain set of conditions is met. For example, when there's a disaster of a certain magnitude in a region, some of those actions that are in the DAP that have been previously identified may come into effect. The DAP will outline the actions we will take to implement these options, either before or after a disaster. The draft guidelines state that DAPs can be developed by the RA or another entity if they are directed by the RA. So some of the benefits of a DAP. Over time, DAPs will reduce the cost and impacts of multiple natural hazards in a particular place. The governance arrangements identified in the draft guidelines will bring all the relevant people to the table, including the community. And this will facilitate more effective partnerships between Commonwealth, state and local government and infrastructure providers, NGOs and others. In bringing together information on all natural hazard risks and sharing this information, we will increase our understanding of natural hazard risk as it occurs in place. By identifying risk reduction investments, DAPs can start to increase the investment in mitigation, adaptation and prevention. moving the dial on the historic spending trends where only 97% of disaster funding has been spent on response and recovery, with only 3% on mitigation, adaptation and prevention. By enabling us to work together, the DAP process will allow us to address issues that were too hard to solve by one stakeholder alone that have previously fallen through the gaps. And importantly, pre-identifying these investments will allow for more effective reconstruction decisions after a disaster, including pre-planning for building back better so that recovery funding can be better utilised. We've completed a number of consultations with local government to date, and this is some of the summary of what we've heard so far. As part of this consultation, we surveyed all New South Wales councils to understand existing plans and resources, key drivers in natural hazard risk, research and planning, risk exposure and current challenges. We had a great response to this survey, and the results were used to inform the design and development of the guidelines. We've also engaged with joint organisations, state government agencies and other relevant stakeholders in the development of the draft DAP guidelines. Through this consultation, we've heard your key concerns, including that council should not be responsible for shouldering all of the work. Councils need support from the state to provide access to reliable, consistent, forward-looking data. And the state needs to play a greater coordination role to help streamline funding and navigate policy roadblocks at the state level. We've listened to this feedback, and so we're proposing a collaborative approach in the draft guidelines so that we are partnering with councils and other stakeholders to deliver this important work. The RA will facilitate the development of DAPs in collaboration with councils, state government agencies, critical infrastructure providers, Aboriginal landowners and communities. The RA will also support the sharing of information and data and will have a focus on building capability across the system. We've proposed a multi-hazard, locally shaped, regionally coordinated and state-facilitated approach. The scale of the challenges we are facing means that both the problems and solutions for disaster adaptation planning cross local government boundaries, and this is a key point. We also know that successful disaster adaptation planning requires collaboration between all levels of government, the community and industry. Acknowledging this, the guidelines propose a regional, multi-hazard approach. The boundaries and governance arrangements for each DAP region will be established collaboratively during the earlier stage of the DAP development process. Regional DAPs will significantly improve our ability to address multiple kinds of natural hazard risks in a coordinated way. They will allow for the identification and implementation of regional scale solutions, cost sharing, increased sharing of data and research across multiple hazards, and improve access to subject matter specialists and funding pathways. The RA is already leading work across 2 regional DAPs in 2 high-risk areas, with work underway in the Northern Rivers and the Hawkesbury-Nepean Valley. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Hala Hubrecht, who is the Acting Executive Director, Adaptation and Mitigation, who will take you through the process for developing a DAP. Thanks, Hala.
Thank you, Amanda. So the guidelines outline a 5-stage process for developing a DAP, which I'll describe in a bit more detail in a sec. The guidelines outline an approach that has community engagement embedded at every stage, along with independent assurance facilitated by the RA. So engaging the community from the earliest parts of preparing a DAP and throughout implementation will be key to the success of the process. We have listened to feedback provided about needing to reduce the burden on local councils. So as part of stage 1 readiness, the draft guidelines propose a coordinated place and community-centred approach to disaster adaptation planning, involving a high degree of collaboration across all stakeholders at the right scale. The diagram you see on the slide provides an indicative or template structure for the governance arrangements proposed. So stage 1 readiness involves agreeing to regional governance arrangements and setting regional boundaries in a co-design fashion. Regional DAP steering committees will be established, consisting of executive level representatives from all levels of government to ensure the needs of each are represented and considered. Councils and JOs will be key members of these steering committees. The Regional Steering Committee, co-chaired by the RA, will provide strategic coordination, oversight and collective decision-making. They will support linkages to broader state-level decision-making and policy, such as land use planning, transport planning. Technical or thematic working groups, community and stakeholder engagement forums will also be established to enable early and effective engagement of subject matter specialists and affected communities. It is proposed that the coordination of actions by other organisations such as critical infrastructure providers, non-government organisations, including community organisations, and industry such as banking and finance will be facilitated through state coordination groups convened by the RA. In stage 2, which is about understanding place, understanding place involves understanding how hazard risk now and the future would look like if action isn't taken. So hazard studies by councils, such as studies completed to inform floodplain risk management plans, will be crucial inputs to this stage. And where actions to reduce risk are already underway by councils or others, this will be factored in. This stage will also involve identifying the problems we need to solve and the opportunities we can see to reduce disaster risk. At this stage, we will also start to collate potential options to reduce disaster risk. It's also very important that we have community engagement commencing at this stage to gain a collective, comprehensive understanding of place. Stage 3 options and adaptation pathways assessment involves more detailed exploration of risk reduction options, which are assembled into packages of complementary options, and these are called adaptation pathways that understand the role of implementing options today or potentially the role of implementing options in the future. Options that have been previously identified in council plans that have not been progressed can be reconsidered at this point. The options are then funneled through and assessed to identify a preferred adaptation pathway to be taken forward. In terms of stage 4 and 5, which is plan finalisation and implementation, it involves the preparation and consultation on the final DAP, as well as supporting implementation plans. So DAPs will set out a plan of short, medium and longer term actions to implement that preferred adaptation pathway with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Some actions may need to be implemented at a local scale and others at a regional, state or federal scale. The RA will coordinate New South Wales government support for the DAP process, including state-level actions set out in the DAP and alignment with relevant state policy. Councils and other organisations, as owners of relevant local actions, will prepare supporting implementation plans. These plans are intended to inform operational plans, asset management plans, or potentially council integrated planning and reporting processes. The steering committee established during stage 1 will continue to support implementation. The DAP will also include funding and financing pathways to support delivery of the actions. Stage 5, implementation and monitoring, is the stage at which actions identified in the DAP and implementation plan are delivered and progress is monitored to ensure that the DAP is reviewed or refreshed as needed. And with that, I've provided a high-level overview of the stages in the process. And I'm able to hand back to Amanda Leck to take us to next steps.
Thanks very much. So today's webinar is the first step, if you like, or first stage in our broader consultation. We have an 8-week consultation plan that will be coming to regional locations across New South Wales for both in-person, face-to-face consultation sessions, but also for us to do some online sessions as well. We've tried to make it as flexible as we possibly can so that we can engage as deeply as we can with as many of you as we can during this 8-week consultation period. We really want to hear from you the opportunities and challenges that you think the draft guidelines might present for disaster adaptation planning in your region. We know that every region is different, just as every local council area is different, and that's why we think this regional approach will give us the best effect with regard to this disaster adaptation planning approach, but very keen to get your views on that. You can submit feedback as well via the Have Your Say platform, which includes a survey feedback form and also details on how to get in touch with the RA team via email. As I said, we're running face-to-face and online workshops. There'll be a final online workshop offered to anyone who was unable to attend other sessions, and invites to these workshops have been sent out via regional delivery directors, but please reach out to us if you haven't received one. Place your email in the chat and we'll make sure that we get an invitation to you. The feedback that we receive through this 8-week consultation period will help us to shape the final version of the guidelines, which are due for release later in 2024. So we really do look forward to partnering with you all. We see this as a really important next step in getting some joined up disaster adaptation planning happening between local government, state government, and also with our Commonwealth government partners. We see it as critical to involve councils, communities, and the business community, not-for-profits, so that we can all come to the table to plan together about delivering, healthy and prosperous futures for our communities. Now, we are happy to take some questions. I see that there's some questions that have gone into the chat already, that the team has already sought to moderate some of those questions, but happy to take some more direct questions. If people would like to put up their hand, Hala, I'm thinking. We're able to take questions, so over to you all. Just while we're waiting for people to put their hands up, I noticed that there's been a few questions online around, do DAPs avoid duplication of activities already embedded in floodplain risk management plans, bushfire risk management plans, and the like? Hala, I'll go to you to answer that question.
Yeah, so as I outlined in the process, studies completed for those plans would inform stage 2 in particular, which is about understanding place, and any actions already implemented through that would be taken into account. Where actions have been identified through those processes to reduce risk that have not been implemented for whatever reason, they can be reconsidered as part of the DAP process. So the intention is definitely not to duplicate those, but to build off them. I see there was one question that asked whether those processes and plans need to be completed and endorsed to be incorporated into a DAP. And the answer to that is not necessarily. So we will meet each region where it's at in terms of what it's been able to complete, and where there are gaps, we will support next steps.
Thanks very much, Hala. And I see Tim Butcher, you have your hand up. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. My question is just in terms of the regional DAPs and establishing the place. Do you see that to be based on river catchments or based on regional emergency management areas, or do you have any concept about how that's going to be applied at this stage? And second part of the question is it likely that an LGA may be in 2 different regional DAPs?
I'll answer the second part of your question first, Tim, if I could. No, we are not planning that an LGA would be in 2 regional DAPs. So that would be one of the principles, that the LGA would be within 1 regional area. But I'll go to Hala for the first part of your question.
Yeah, so as part of stage one of the actual process, we'll be looking to co-design that regional boundary. Some of the things that we acknowledge would need to be considered are the geophysical boundaries. So as you raise catchments or potentially sand compartments for coastal hazard risks, and flood and coastal hazard being the key risks that we need to address. So that could be a driver. In addition, existing administrative boundaries, so planning regions, JO regions, all of that would be factored in. So for each region, it will look slightly different depending on what makes sense there.
Thank you.
And I think important to know that is a key part of the readiness stage for us to engage with you all to determine what makes sense for your region. So there's no predetermined notion of what that will look like. It's about what makes sense. So as we said, we have 2 DAPs underway. We have one underway in the Hawkesbury and Nepean Valley focused on flood risk, and then the one in the Northern Rivers with the 7 local councils there are focused on multi-hazard risk. And it's been what makes sense with regard to those local governments that are involved in those respective DAPs. I see we have another hand up. Let me just see if I can see who that is.
Andrew.
Andrew, over to you, Andrew.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wanting to ask, is it possible to make a case for one single council area to have its own DAP? Or is that under a principles approach of regions not able to be done?
Well, I think that would be part of the co-design process in stage one. I think, as we said, it would depend on what's suitable for that region. There are some councils that are larger in area than others. And I think, again, depending on how the hazard profile looks in that region, these existing administrative boundaries, it may be that we end up with one LGA as a region. But I think the principle is to look at things in a collaborative fashion to begin with.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
I can see some in the chat, which I can try and address. So in terms of timing for developing the DAPs, so the stage, as we've said, there are some DAPs that are already underway, and they have their own timeframes that have been published. But also for other regions, we would be looking to work through that first stage, which is readiness, establishing the governance arrangements and the forward plan within the next, so by the end of next year. But beyond that timeline for completing the DAPs for each region will be dependent on the resourcing and plan for each of those regions. And then I think there would be another one.
There's a question, Hala, about whether the Northern Rivers and the HNV have followed the DAP guidelines. And I think the answer to that would be yes, and they have informed the development of these guidelines. So the HNV DAP, for those who are aware, has been underway for some time now and built on previous work that was underway as part of other work led by Infrastructure New South Wales. But largely the process that we've come up with in the guidelines has been informed by our real world experience working in both the HNV and more recently in the Northern Rivers. The HNV DAP has been underway for some time, so is deep into options assessment now, whereas for the Northern Rivers area, we are very much working on the readiness phase, so establishing all of the governance, establishing all of the engagement with local councils and with hazard agencies in that particular part of the state, so that we can all start to shape up the next stages for that DAP in terms of understanding place and understanding hazard risk. But first of all, we're taking that process through the readiness phase, and that's where we are at with regard to the work in the Northern Rivers currently. Are there any other questions? Would anyone else like to put their hand up, or we can keep working through the online? Okay, Peter, over to you, Peter Sheath.
Yeah, Peter Sheath, Central Coast Council. Just a question about how the DAPs are going to consider climate change. So I presume that there's going to be some sort of consistency across the state in terms of how to deal with sea level rise and increases in rainfall intensity, but also what appropriate planning horizons would be for, different types of infrastructure or whatever that the DAP's going to consider. So given that there has been some sort of work already in some areas, I'm just wondering if those sort of assumptions are going to be rolled out across the state.
Yeah, so as part of stage 2, understanding risk now and into the future, climate change and population growth are going to be the 2 key drivers of future risk. And then some consistency around how we assess that is definitely part of the process and the support that we intend to provide. So in answer to your question, yes.
So have you landed on anything as yet, or is that down the track?
No. Yeah, that would be part of the process of undertaking that work.
There was a question earlier, Peter, maybe not asked by you, about NARCLM, the NARCLM data coming down later this year. So obviously that will have an impact on how we factor that into the future.
Okay, thanks.
Nicole, over to you, Nicole Parsons. Or is it Anna Mitchell?
Yeah, thanks. It's me, Anna. Yeah, look, that was actually my question in the chat about NARCLM, so I was just going to ask it verbally as well, because it seems like we've been waiting for that updated NARCLM for quite a long time, and this would be the perfect opportunity for everyone to make use of it, so we're all using consistent data for this work. So I know that that's not in RA's jurisdiction, but it would be really good to be able to make use of that as we go into this next process.
Absolutely.
I think it's also important to note that, no information it's what we have point in time. And I think to Harla's point, these are disaster adaptation plans. So they will set an adaptation pathway, but if an event occurs during that time period of the DAP being in place, it may take us down a different adaptation pathway if there's a major disaster in an area. For example, we may have some predetermined actions that we would take that would be identified and agreed as part of the DAP process and then put in place should there be a disaster event. So we are dealing with uncertainty here, and I think it's really important that we call that out. We're dealing with change and uncertainty, and our models will only be as good as the data we have, and it's going to be critical that, our disaster adaptation plans are, updated regularly. They're not just plans on a shelf, but they become living documents that we all work to implement over a period of time. Are there other questions, Harla, that you wanted to get to in the chat?
Amanda, I think we've got Nicole Parsons back now.
Have we? Nicole.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Thanks so much for the information. Fantastic. And just building, I think, on some of the previous comments just around what could councils start doing in terms of being prepared. If we've got, I guess, identification of certain data sets, plans, policies, information to feed into that readiness process, across councils and across regions. I guess the other piece is around that inter and intra-agency I guess consultation and collaboration across state agency departments. So I noticed during the steering committee, we've got DeFi, we've got councils, we've got JOs, we've got Reconstruction Authority listed there as well as others. Will that be something that is driven at a regional level in those sort of interagency consultations, or at that state level as well?
Yeah, so it would be driven at the regional level. So across all those agencies for that region, but that will then link back into state level decision making, particularly kind of the loop back on key policy decisions like land use planning, transport planning, infrastructure planning. And that's really one of the main impetuses behind this regional approach, which is to link up levels of government, so local to state to federal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'll go to Tim Mackney now. No, I think his hand's still up. Are you with us, Tim?
Yeah, sorry, I did the famous stay on mute. Yeah, Tim Mackney from Tweed. Just following on from Nicole's question, and probably thinking a little bit about, the guidelines are coming out. Some of this is, if it's going to be at a regional scale, will cause a lot of or need a lot of coordination, across NRJOs, as Nicole said, with state entities. A lot of work there, and obviously council staff will need to be involved. But has there been any thought in how this is going to be resourced? Is that something that's going to come out with the guidelines? Is it something that's RA-led and councils are just feeding into, or is, as often the way, is a lot of this weight going to fall to councils to actually find time alongside BAU to implement?
So, Tim, very much we see this as being RA-led and resourced. So the work in the Northern Rivers, we have a team up there working on the Northern Rivers DAP now, and I could see Christy Clark online who is leading that effort with her team there. So if we haven't come and spoken to you yet about the regional DAP, we certainly will. But there has been consistent meetings with councils across the Northern Rivers with regard to the Northern Rivers DAP. And likewise with the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley DAP, we have a team here at RA that's been working on that for many, many months now, building on previous work that was done. But we do see this as being something that the RA will need to lean into and provide resources to support councils with the delivery of these regional DAPs. So we see councils absolutely being part of this process, but we want the RA to be able to work with you, and to that end, we'll be working with government about how that looks, and it will probably vary based on, the different regional catchments that we work with as well.
Yeah,
I hope that answers your question.
I was just going to jump in there, Amanda, and say, Tim, we've got time with the Tweed exec at 8:30 on Wednesday morning, and obviously we'll be leveraging work that's already been completed by Tweed Shire Council, so we can chat to you further on Wednesday morning. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. And not taking away anything of that work that's obviously already been happening, which we've been involved in. It was more whether that was going to become sort of enshrined in the guidelines. So, yeah, thank you.
Look, that's how we see it. We know that this is not just something that we can put some guidelines out and then basically say, over to you, councils, develop the DAPs. We know that, for example, RA is going to support very heavily with regard to the hazard risk data. And, looking at what that looks like for your, for the given regional footprint that we have. We'll also be supporting with assurance and capability development. So it will be sort of on a region by region basis as to what level of support the regional councils will need to get this work done.
Yeah, and to feed off, to follow that as well. So our consultation over the next 2 months is to get feedback across the regions in terms of our approach. So our approach is that we are leaning in, as Amanda put it, to support coordination, data input, assurance, etc. But then what local councils and other organisations need to participate in that process is one of the key questions we'll be asking. And also feedback on that approach, and that will be used to finalise the guidelines later in the year and then confirm next steps and resourcing, particularly for stage 1. Yep. There is a question in the chat which was about the upcoming 3-hour workshops for the purposes of consultation or plan development, and I kind of answered that now, which was that we're seeking your feedback on how we intend to approach it, including the role of the RA versus the role of yourselves and other stakeholders, and what you need to make it successful. So that is the impetus of the consultation, so that when we do finalise the guidelines, they are meeting expectations.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands going up. Are there any further questions? Okay, look, I might just hand back to you, Mel, for a few concluding remarks, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda, and thank you, Hala, for providing that information today. And thank you to all of you for coming online this afternoon. I think it's really important, and it would be remiss of me not to thank councils and your engagement over probably the past 2 years at least in terms of natural disasters and the work that's been done whilst the RA's only been stood up now for about 16 or 17 months, I think you're all aware, whether it's through your councils or whether the work that has been done in other parts of the state, the enormous interaction we've had with councils as part of disaster recovery. So if I can just thank the councils for that. Tim's question was a really important one, and I think it was well answered at the time. It's important that RA is not seen to be doing DAPs to councils and to communities. We want to work with you. Part of the engagement is to make sure that we get this right, and we work with councils, but I'm enormously aware of the huge workload that councils have had, and we're very mindful of not burdening councils overly with what we do. So it's going to be one of those ones through this engagement as part of the guidelines, really understanding how we can work best with you to make sure that disaster adaptation plans work and they work for the community. So thank you again for all coming online today. There's going to be some mixed opportunities, obviously, with Have Your Say, with the actual workshops to engage councils and to engage with you. But you can reach out at any time and we're happy to address it. I think what's important is that you have access to RA and get the information that you require. So just on behalf of the Reconstruction Authority, can I thank you again for the working relationships we've had over the more recent period, and I look forward to working with you through this consultation phase. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.
So, bye.
Thank you all.